Today we will look at modern American history through the presidents. Gerald Ford took over when Richard Nixon resigned, and the American people then elected an unknown governor from Georgia, Jimmy Carter, in 1976. In 1980, Ronald Reagan would mark a move to the right in the United States and really be the birth of the modern conservative movement. His vice president, George H.W. Bush, would be president when the Cold War ended and be defeated by a young Democrat from Arkansas, Bill Clinton, in 1992. Surviving impeachment and overseeing a period of great economic growth, Bill Clinton would be replaced by George W. Bush after one of the closest elections in American history in 2000. 8 months after taking the oath of office, the Bush administration would face the first attack on American soil since World War II on September 11, 2001, and lead the United States into two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In 2008, Bush would be replaced by Barack Obama, the first African American to serve as President of the United States. And this is where we find ourselves today. It's the recent past. After Richard Nixon resigned in 1974 rather than face impeachment, Gerald Ford became president. Ford's decision to pardon the former president did not sit well with the American people, who rejected Ford in 1976, electing Jimmy Carter, who was viewed as an outsider. The Carter administration was marked by a poor economy and the impact of Watergate. Two major events from the Carter administration were the Camp David Accords, where Jimmy Carter brought the leaders of Egypt and Israel together and hammered out a peace agreement. While this part of the world is still embroiled in conflict, the Camp David Accords marked a high point for the move towards peace in the Middle East. Carter was also president during the Iran hostage crisis, where more than 50 Americans were taken hostage after the Shah, who was supported by the United States, was overthrown. Carter worked tirelessly to end the crisis, but the hostages would not be freed until after Carter left the White House. In 1980, Ronald Reagan, former actor and governor of California, would be elected president of the United States. Some refer to his election as the Reagan Revolution, as his election ushered in an era of conservatism in the United States that would become a dominant force on the American political landscape. This conservatism emphasized cutting taxes to stimulate the economy. This is where the ideas of supply-side or trickle-down economics comes from. Cutting taxes is one of the most important principles for many conservatives. Also, conservatives argue that the government should do less and have more power should be given to the states. Reagan and his conservative allies wanted to appoint judges who would not try to bring sweeping change to the United States. They would practice what is known as judicial restraint. Conservatives argue for deregulation, which is less regulations and fewer roles for the government. Many conservatives have argued for getting rid of the Department of Education or the Environmental Protection Agency. Lastly, conservatives advocate for increased military spending. Remember, when Reagan came into office, the Cold War was still going on. It was one of his goals to put pressure on the Soviet Union through things like the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was the plan to be able to shoot down missiles from space. Critics coined this Star Wars. The election of Reagan in 1980 and again in 1984 and the impact of conservatism would have a major effect on American politics for the rest of the 20th century. Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, would be elected in 1988, and his son, George W. Bush, would be elected in 2000, both as conservative Republicans. The Bushes would be only the second father-son team to be elected president of the United States. Reagan conservatism would also impact the Democratic Party, as Bill Clinton would win the presidency in 1992 as a much more moderate Democrat, not liberal like those Democrats that came before him. And in 1994, Republican victories in the midterm elections gave Republicans control of the House of Representatives and Senate for the first time since the early Cold War. It was during this time that Newt Gingrich came to prominence as Speaker of the House. George Herbert Walker Bush would serve as Reagan's vice president for 8 years and would benefit from Reagan's popularity. He would be elected president in 1988. During his time in office, Bush would see the end of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall would fall along with communism in Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union would break apart with those satellite countries emerging as independent countries. East and West Germany would reunify and be a single country again for the first time since 1945. And the Persian Gulf War, codenamed Operation Desert Storm, would take place. As the leader of Iraq, Saddam Hussein was viewed as a threat by the United States in the Middle East. Hussein had waged a war with Iran with support of the United States during the 1980s. But in 1980, when Iraq invaded oil-rich Kuwait, the United States would spring into action. The United States would send 500,000 troops into Iraq alongside 260,000 troops from its allies in the region. The war started with major airstrikes, and after only 100 hours on the ground, Hussein would be defeated. For women, the Persian Gulf War would be the first time women would serve in combat roles. And at the war's end, the victors would choose not to remove Saddam Hussein from power, but the United States would return for Hussein 13 years later. Bill Clinton's election in 1992 marked the birth of what would be New Democrats. Unlike his Democratic predecessors like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Jimmy Carter, Clinton would govern as a moderate rather than a liberal. He would talk about balancing budgets and welfare reforms. His election in 1992 was the first time since the Great Depression that the economy, not defense, was the central issue of a campaign. As president, Clinton signed the North American Free Trade Association, which created a free trade zone with Canada and Mexico. The elimination of tariffs and trade barriers made goods from Canada and Mexico cheaper and increased the debate between cheaper prices for goods and American jobs at home in the United States. We will discuss outsourcing a little bit more next time. An issue that dominated the Clinton years was his impeachment in 1998 for perjury and obstruction of justice stemming from the Monica Lewinsky affair. Like Andrew Johnson, the only other U.S. president to be impeached, Clinton was not removed from office. Regarding the Lewinsky affair, the American people learned a lot more about their president than they probably wanted to know. Humanitarianism was a driving force in American foreign policy after the Cold War. Economic sanctions were lifted on South Africa when the government ended the policy of apartheid that had separated South Africa by race since 1948. Following the end of apartheid, Nelson Mandela would be elected as the president of South Africa. The Clinton administration also established diplomatic relations with Vietnam. This was important because the United States had not had a relationship with Vietnam since Americans were forced to flee the embassy in Saigon after the Vietnam War in 1975. The major foreign policy event of the Clinton administration took place in the former Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia had been created as a country after World War I and had been under the influence of the Soviet Union during the Cold War until it broke up in the early 1990s. There were several different ethnic groups in this part of Europe that were fighting for supremacy. You had Serbs and Croats, Bosnian Muslims, and all of these groups wanted to form their own countries. The United States sponsored a ceasefire in 1995 to get some control in the area. It was part of a NATO multinational force in the Balkan Peninsula. Slobodan Milosevic was the president of Serbia. He sent troops into the province of Kosovo when that province was seeking independence. His goal was to eliminate ethnic Albanians. In response to the killing of hundreds of thousands of ethnic and religious minorities, or ethnic cleansing, and Milosevic's refusal to talk peace, NATO launched an air attack against Serbia and Milosevic in 1999. And eventually Serbia would be forced to withdraw and Milosevic arrested, and he would be put on trial before the International War Crimes Tribunal for genocide. The Kosovo War is an example of a war waged in the post-Cold War era for humanitarian reasons. More people voted for Al Gore than George W. Bush in the 2000 election, but that is not how presidents are elected. George Bush's narrow victory in Florida would give him the Electoral College and the presidency in one of the closest elections in American history. His presidency would change on September 11, 2001, when coordinated attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. by al-Qaeda using commercial aircraft were launched on the United States. A fourth plane went down in Pennsylvania. In response to the attacks of September 11th, the United States first launched a war in Afghanistan in October 2001, and then a war in Iraq in 2003. Saddam Hussein was removed from power in 2003 when Baghdad fell. He was tried, and in 2006 he was executed. Osama bin Laden, the mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks, was found in Pakistan and killed in 2011. The United States has turned over combat operations to security forces in Iraq and are working on a similar conclusion to the war in Afghanistan. All told, over 6,000 Americans have died in the war on terrorism in Iraq and Afghanistan. Let's close the show by looking at the war on terrorism, security, and civil liberties. After 9/11, there was heightened security across the United States. There were stricter screenings at airports. The Department of Homeland Security was created. The country was on edge. The government passed the Patriot Act, which gave it the increased power to obtain information and expand surveillance against citizens. It was now easier for the government to wiretap phones, monitor emails, or look at individuals' medical and financial information. The Patriot Act gave the government unparalleled powers, which critics said violated the civil liberties of Americans. The question, as always, is, are your rights different in a time of war? We'll meet one more time next time and close this show once and for all. But until then, good night, Albuquerque.